I was sitting at a small cafe table beside the Seine River in Paris, France. The coffee was warm. The morning air was cool. And for the first time in 6 years, 6 long, exhausting, thankless years, I was not thinking about spreadsheets, quarterly reports, or someone else's business. I was just breathing. I am 61 years old. My name is Raymond Caldwell. And if you looked at me sitting at that cafe table in my old gray sweater, reading a paperback novel and sipping coffee like a retired schoolteacher on holiday, you would never guess that, for the past 6 years, I had quietly and single-handedly rescued a failing company from the edge of complete collapse. But that is the thing about quiet men like me. Nobody notices the hands holding everything together until those hands let go. My phone buzzed on the table. I looked down. The name on the screen was Gerald Whitmore, my father-in-law, the man who owned the company I had been working myself to the bone for, the man whose empire I had saved, the man who had never once, not once in 6 years, said the words "thank you" to my face. I picked up the phone, and what came out of that man's mouth in the next 30 seconds would change everything for him, for his family, and honestly for me too. But here is the thing. Here is what nobody expected. I laughed. I actually laughed. And then I hung up. And when I returned home 2 weeks later, oh, the look on their faces, that is a story I need to tell you from the very beginning. So sit down, get comfortable, because this one is going to take a while. I grew up in a small town in Ohio called Maplewood. Population, not very many. My father was a mechanic. My mother was a nurse who worked double shifts 3 days a week to make sure my younger sister and I had everything we needed. We were not poor, but we were not rich either. We were what you might call honest people. People who worked hard, kept their heads down, and genuinely believed, that if you did good things quietly and consistently, the world would eventually notice. I carried that belief my whole life. I studied accounting at a state university. Nothing fancy, no Ivy League name on my diploma. I worked part-time in a grocery warehouse to pay my tuition. After I graduated, I got a job at a small financial consulting firm and spent the next 15 years learning everything there was to know about corporate finance, business restructuring, and how to make failing companies breathe again. I was good at it, very good. But I was also, and I say this knowing it was both my greatest strength and my greatest weakness, I was also a man who never shouted about what he could do. I simply did it, and then at 43 years old I met Margaret. Margaret was beautiful, not in the way that magazine covers tell you beauty looks. She was beautiful in the way that certain people are: warm eyes, a laugh that made a room feel lighter, and a kindness that she showed to everyone equally, whether you were a waiter at a restaurant or the president of a bank. We met at a community fundraiser for a local children's hospital. She was organizing volunteers. I was one of them. She handed me a clipboard and told me to sign in. I signed in. Then I asked her to dinner. She said no. I asked again 3 weeks later. She said yes. We were married within a year. What I did not fully understand until after the wedding, and this is important because it changes everything that comes next, what I did not fully understand was just how complicated Margaret's family was. Gerald Whitmore was Margaret's father. He was the kind of man who walked into rooms like he had already purchased them. 70 years old, silver hair always perfectly combed, a suit that probably cost more than my first car. He had built Whitmore Industries from a mid-size manufacturing business into a regional powerhouse, building materials, logistics, supply chain. Not glamorous work, but profitable if you ran it correctly. And for a long time, Gerald had run it very correctly. The problem was, by the time Margaret and I got married, Gerald was getting older. His instincts, which had once been sharp as a new blade, were beginning to slow. The business world was changing faster than he could keep up. And the people around him, the executives he trusted, were beginning to quietly take advantage of the fact that the old lion's eyes were not as sharp as they used to be. Whitmore Industries was bleeding money, slowly, quietly, the way a body bleeds internally, no visible wound, but the damage building up beneath the surface. Gerald did not know how bad it was, or perhaps he knew but refused to admit it. Then there was Margaret's brother, Dennis Whitmore. Dennis was 45 years old, had the title of Vice President of Operations, and had held that title for 8 years without, as far as I could ever determine, doing very much operating of anything. He drove a very expensive car. He attended every golf tournament the company sponsored. He had a corner office with a view and a personal assistant who organized his lunch orders. What Dennis did not have was any real understanding of how the business actually worked. And then there was Gerald's wife, Lorraine Whitmore. Margaret's mother, Lorraine, was a perfectly pleasant woman in social situations. She smiled at dinner parties. She remembered everyone's birthdays. But in private, behind the polished manners, Lorraine had a very clear opinion of me, and that opinion was that I was not good enough for her daughter. I was too ordinary, too quiet, not from money, not from their world. She never said this to my face. She didn't have to. It was in the way she looked at my hands at the dinner table. The way she would tell stories about Margaret's old boyfriends, men from wealthy families, men with impressive surnames, as if these stories were just harmless little memories and not small, calculated messages being sent directly to me. I received every single message. I simply chose not to respond to them. And then there was my wife, Margaret. Margaret loved me. I believe that completely. But Margaret had grown up inside the Whitmore family, which meant she had also grown up believing, without ever examining the belief, that her father was always right, that the family's judgment was always sound, that if Gerald Whitmore said something, it was simply the way things were. It would take 6 years of suffering before she began to question that. About 18 months after our wedding, Gerald called me into his office. I remember the meeting very clearly. He was sitting behind his enormous mahogany desk. He did not offer me a seat immediately. He let me stand there for a moment. I think he did it deliberately, to establish something. And then he waved a hand toward the chair across from him. "Sit down, Raymond." I sat. He pushed a thick folder across the desk toward me. I opened it. It was a financial summary of Whitmore Industries for the previous 3 fiscal years. I read the numbers, and as I read them, my stomach grew very still in the way it does when you recognize something serious. "We have a problem," I said. "I know we have a problem," Gerald said. "That's why you're sitting in that chair." He explained what he wanted. He wanted me to come on as Chief Financial Officer, to restructure the company's finances, to identify where the losses were coming from and stop them, to keep the company alive long enough for Dennis to grow into a real leadership role. I want you to notice that last part. Long enough for Dennis to grow into a real leadership role. That was my job, not to lead, not to receive credit. To fix the problem quietly in the background, while Dennis Whitmore, who did not know the difference between a cash flow statement and a grocery list, was positioned to look like the future of the company. I accepted the job. I accepted it because Margaret was hopeful, because she squeezed my hand that evening and said, "Daddy trusts you, Raymond. This means something." And because, God help me, I genuinely believed that if I did good work, it would eventually be recognized. I was 61 years old when I learned, once and for all, that this belief is not always true. I am not going to describe every detail of what I did over those 6 years, because the specifics are not what this story is about. But I will give you enough so that you understand what I walked away from and why it mattered. In the first year, I discovered that Whitmore Industries had 3 major divisions that were operating at significant losses, hidden through creative bookkeeping that Gerald's longtime accountant, a man named Philip, had been quietly using to make the numbers look better than they were. I am not going to say that Philip was a criminal. I am going to say that Philip had been making Gerald feel comfortable for many years, and comfort can be its own kind of dishonesty. I replaced Philip. Gerald was not happy about it. It was our first serious conflict. In the second year, I renegotiated the company's supplier contracts, which had not been reviewed properly in over a decade. The savings were significant. I also identified 2 logistics managers who were billing the company for work that was never performed. I let them go. Dennis told his father I was being too aggressive. Gerald told me to calm down. I did not calm down. In the third year, I restructured the company's debt. This required difficult conversations with 3 separate financial institutions, none of whom were initially willing to renegotiate terms. I spent 4 months on those conversations, 4 months of early mornings, late nights, and weekends at my desk, while Margaret sat alone in our living room watching television. She never complained, but I saw the loneliness sometimes, sitting quietly in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. By the 4th year, Whitmore Industries was no longer bleeding. The internal losses had been identified and stopped. The finances were stabilizing. The company was not yet thriving, but it was breathing on its own. By the 5th year, the company was profitable again. Not slightly profitable, significantly profitable. Enough that Gerald was able to announce at the annual board dinner that Whitmore Industries had delivered its best financial performance in 12 years. He stood up at that dinner and he gave a speech. He thanked Dennis. He thanked his executive team. He thanked the entire Whitmore family for their strength and dedication. He did not mention my name. I sat at the end of the long dinner table in the chair closest to the kitchen, and I ate my salmon and I said nothing. Margaret reached over under the table and squeezed my hand. That was enough for me, or at least I told myself it was. And then, in the 6th year, something happened that I had not seen coming. It was a Thursday evening in February. I was working late in my office at the Whitmore Industries headquarters. Everyone else had gone home. The building was quiet. I was reviewing a batch of old corporate filings, documents going back 8, 9, 10 years. As part of a routine audit, I was conducting in preparation for a potential expansion into a new market, and then I found something. It was buried in a file from 9 years ago, before I had joined the company. Before my marriage to Margaret, it was a contract, a very specific contract between Whitmore Industries and a consulting firm called Riener and Associates. Now, on the surface, this looked like a normal consulting agreement, but as I read it more carefully, and then read it again, I began to feel something cold moving through my chest. The contract was not a consulting agreement. It was a quiet transfer of intellectual property, specifically a proprietary logistics software system that Whitmore Industries had developed internally at significant expense over a period of 3 years. The system had been the company's greatest competitive advantage in its early growth period. And according to this contract, it had been transferred, essentially given away, to Riener and Associates for a payment of $1. $1. I sat very still for a long time. Then I started tracing who owned Riener and Associates. It took me 3 hours of careful research. Shell companies, nominee directors, layered ownership structures. But eventually, I found the answer. Riener and Associates was owned, through 2 intermediate holding companies, by Dennis Whitmore, Margaret's brother, the vice president of operations, the man whose golf game Gerald subsidized, and whose incompetence I had been quietly compensating for 6 years. Dennis had stolen from his own father's company. He had taken something of enormous value and transferred it to a company he secretly owned 9 years ago, before I arrived, before the company began struggling, before anyone was paying close enough attention. And the losses I had been working to fix for 6 years, a significant portion of them traced back to the competitive disadvantage the company had suffered after quietly losing this technology. I held the document in my hands, and I thought about what to do. I could take it directly to Gerald. But then something else occurred to me, something that I was ashamed of even noticing, but I noticed it anyway. I was 61 years old. I had given 6 years of my life to this company. I had been treated as invisible, as ordinary, as barely worth acknowledging, by every single member of this family except my wife. And now I held in my own hands the truth that would crack open everything they thought they knew about their perfect family. I put the document in my briefcase. I took it home. I scanned it and stored it securely in 3 separate places. And then I did something that I had not done in 6 years. I booked a trip to Paris. I had not taken a single vacation day in 6 years. Not one. I had not taken sick days. I had not taken personal days. I had worked through 3 Christmases, 2 Thanksgivings, and my own 61st birthday, which fell on a Wednesday in October, and which I spent reviewing acquisition documents for a potential deal that Gerald ultimately decided not to pursue. Before I left for Paris, I sent an email to Gerald. Professional, polite, informing him that I would be taking 14 days of accrued leave, effective immediately, and that I had briefed my deputy on all active matters requiring attention during my absence. Gerald replied within the hour. The reply was 4 words long. This is not ideal. I replied with 2 words, understood, goodbye, and I got on the plane. Paris in early spring is one of the most beautiful things on this earth. If you have never been, if you are ever able to go, go. The light in Paris in April is soft and golden in a way that feels almost deliberately kind. The streets smell of bread and coffee, and the kind of old stone that has watched centuries of human drama pass by with perfect indifference. I walked, I read, I ate slowly. I sat at cafe tables beside the river, and I watched people go about their lives, and I felt, for the first time in years, like I was a human being rather than a machine. On the 5th day, my phone rang. Gerald Whitmore. I answered. Raymond. His voice was the same as always. Clipped, certain. The voice of a man who had never once in his life questioned whether he had the right to speak. Gerald, I said, what exactly do you think you are doing? I'm on vacation, I said. I mentioned it in my email. An email, he repeated, as though the word tasted bad. You sent an email. Raymond, the Hargreaves contract meeting is in 9 days, and you have simply vanished. My deputy has all the files, Gerald. He's well prepared. There was a pause. And then Gerald Whitmore said something that, even knowing what I knew about this man, even after 6 years of quiet dismissals and invisible treatment, still surprised me. Let me be very clear with you, he said, and his voice had taken on a new quality, hard, contemptuous. I don't know what kind of holiday fantasy you've decided to indulge, but let me explain your situation to you very simply. You are an employee of this company, my company, and employees of my company do not simply disappear to Paris. He said the word as though it were a joke without proper authorization. You have not received proper authorization. What you have done is abandoned your responsibilities, and frankly, it tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you are. He paused again. Then he said, and I remember every single word, you are fired, Raymond, effective immediately. We don't need a lazy pig on this payroll. Pack your things when you get back, if you decide to come back. I looked out over the Seine River. A boat was passing slowly on the water below. An elderly couple stood at the railing. The woman was pointing at something on the far bank. The man leaned in to look, and then he laughed a real, full laugh and put his arm around her. I laughed too, not at the couple, at the absurd, magnificent perfection of this moment. I actually laughed out loud, sitting at my cafe table in Paris, while Gerald Whitmore spluttered on the other end of the phone. Raymond, Are you laughing? I am speaking to you. I hung up. I set the phone down on the table. I ordered another coffee, and I sat there in the Paris morning light, and I thought about what came next. My phone buzzed for the next 4 days like it was possessed. Gerald, Dennis, the company's HR director. Dennis again, Gerald's personal assistant. Dennis 3 more times. I did not answer any of them. On the 6th day, Margaret called. I answered immediately. Raymond. Her voice was tight with worry. Raymond, what is happening? Daddy called me, and he said, I know what he said, sweetheart. He said you hung up on him. He said you're fired. He said, I know. Raymond, you can't just, why aren't you answering anyone's calls? Dennis says the Hargreaves meeting. The Hargreaves meeting will be fine, I said gently. Robert has everything he needs. But why? She stopped. I could hear her trying to organize her thoughts. Raymond, come home, please. Just come home and we can sort this out. Daddy is very upset, and if you just, Margaret, I said, I love you very much, and I will be home in 9 days, exactly as I planned, and when I get home, I promise you everything will become very clear. A long silence. Are you all right? She asked, and beneath the worry and the confusion, I heard what was really in her voice. What was always in her voice when she spoke to me, underneath everything else. She loved me. She genuinely loved me. I'm better than I've been in years, I said, and I meant it. After we hung up, I took out my notebook and I began to write. Not a letter, not yet. I wrote a list. Every significant contribution I had made to Whitmore Industries over 6 years. Every contract renegotiated. Every loss identified and stopped. Every difficult conversation held. Every crisis managed. Every decision that had quietly saved something that no one ever acknowledged needed saving. I wrote for 2 hours. Then I put the notebook away and went for a long walk along the river. I came home on a Tuesday morning. Margaret was at the airport. She looked tired. She held me for a long moment when I came through the arrivals door, and I held her back, and neither of us said anything for a little while. In the car, she told me what had been happening while I was gone. The Hargreaves meeting had not gone well. Robert, my deputy, who was competent, but who had never actually run a meeting of that magnitude, had apparently struggled without me there to anchor the process. The client had left without signing. The contract, worth a significant amount of money, was now in jeopardy. Gerald was furious. He was blaming me, telling anyone who would listen that my irresponsible vacation had cost the company a major deal. Dennis had been installed as the person overseeing the financial department in my absence. In 9 days, he had apparently managed to create a situation with the company's payroll processing that the HR director described in a message to Margaret as a significant administrative mess. So things are not going well, I said. No, Margaret said quietly, they're really not. She glanced at me. Raymond, what are you planning to do? I'm going to have a meeting, I said, with your father and Dennis, and I think probably the full board. She looked at me for a long moment. Are you going to fight for your job? I looked out the window at the familiar streets of our city. No, I said, I'm going to tell the truth. I called Gerald's personal assistant and requested a formal board meeting within 48 hours. Gerald, to his credit, or perhaps out of sheer fury, agreed. I think he expected the meeting to be my apology, my return on bent knee. The meeting room at Whitmore Industries headquarters was on the 14th floor. To ceiling windows, long glass table. Gerald sat at the head. Dennis sat to his right. The 4 remaining board members were present. The company's lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, sat along the side wall. I sat directly across from Gerald. I placed a folder on the table. Then I placed another folder. Then a third. Gerald looked at the folders the way a man looks at something he cannot quite identify. Well, he said, you wanted this meeting, Raymond. You have it. I assume this is where you explain yourself. Yes, I said, it is. And then I began. I told them who I was, not emotionally, but with facts. I presented a document by document account of every significant financial intervention I had made over 6 years. The numbers were precise. The evidence was clear. I had organized everything methodically, the way you do when you have had 9 days in Paris to think about how to present a case. I showed them the state of the company when I had arrived. I showed them the state of the company now, the difference between those two things in revenue, in debt levels, in operational efficiency, in market position, was not subtle. The board members were quiet. Gerald's expression had shifted from contemptuous to uncertain. Dennis was looking at the table. The Hargreaves contract, I said, was lost not because I took a vacation. It was lost because no one else in this building understood the history of our relationship with that client well enough to conduct the meeting without me. That is not a criticism of Robert, who did his best. It is simply an indication of how much institutional knowledge was concentrated in one person who was never once given a proper title, proper credit, or a single day of paid leave in 6 years. Silence. I reached into the third folder. And now, I said, I need to present something that is somewhat more serious. I slid the contract across the table, the Riener and Associates contract. Intellectual property transfer, $1. I watched Gerald's face as he read it. I watched the blood drain out of it. Then I watched him look at Dennis. Dennis had gone very still, very, very still. The way a person goes still when the room they are standing in has suddenly become dangerous. Dennis, Gerald said. His voice was completely different now. All the power had gone out of it. Dennis, what is this? Dennis said nothing. Dennis, Gerald's voice cracked slightly. I need you to tell me what this is. Dennis looked up, and I will tell you in that moment I did not feel triumph. I want you to know that I felt something much quieter, something closer to sadness. Dad, Dennis said. His voice was very small. I can explain. I don't think you can. Patricia Chen said from the side of the room. She had already read the document. She was already making notes. What followed was the longest 3 hours I have ever sat through. Dennis eventually admitted haltingly, painfully, in pieces, of what he had done 9 years ago. He had been approached by a competitor. He had been offered a financial arrangement. He had been young and greedy and afraid, and he had convinced himself that damage would be manageable, that no one would ever trace it back. He had lived with it for 9 years. Gerald Whitmore, a man I had never once seen show physical weakness, put his face in his hand at the end of the table, and he wept, quietly, but he wept. I am not going to pretend that everything that followed was simple. It wasn't. Dennis's situation was handled legally. I will not go in the details, out of respect for Margaret, who loved her brother despite everything, and who suffered greatly in the months that followed. Legal consequences were serious. His position at the company was, of course, terminated. Gerald Whitmore went through something in the weeks after that meeting that I think can only be described as a reckoning. He was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He was a proud man who had built something real, and who had, over time, allowed that pride to calcify into a kind of blindness. He had looked at me for 6 years and seen only an ordinary man, a quiet man, a man who was not from his world, and in doing so he had failed to see what was actually right in front of him. He came to our house 3 weeks after the board meeting. On a Saturday afternoon, he sat in our living room in the same chair I had sat in hundreds of times, after hundreds of late nights, eating reheated dinner because I had worked past 9 p.m. again, and he said to me, Raymond, I owe you an apology. I looked at him. He looked like he had aged 10 years. The silver hair was the same, but something behind his eyes had changed. Something that had been very certain was now much less so. I treated you like hired help, he said. You were saving my company, and I treated you like someone I had done a favor by hiring. I said something to you on the phone that was unforgivable, and I need you to know that I know that. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, Gerald, I need you to understand something. I didn't do what I did for your gratitude. I did it because your daughter loves you, and because your company employed good people who deserved a chance to keep their jobs. I did it because it was the right thing to do, not for a reward, not for recognition. Because it was right. He nodded. He couldn't quite meet my eyes. But, I said, if you want to know whether what you said to me hurt on the phone and over the years, yes. It hurt, not because I needed you to think I was important, but because I am a human being. And I would have liked, just once, to have been treated like one. Lorraine Whitmore, who had come with him, sat in the other chair with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes very bright. She didn't speak for most of the conversation, but as they were leaving, she stopped in the hallway, and she turned to me and said, "Raymond, I made a judgment about you a long time ago that was very wrong. I'm sorry. It was 4 sentences, but I could tell how much it had cost her to say them. I shook her hand. We are not Gerald and I. We are not what you would call close. That wound does not simply heal because an apology is offered, but we are something that functions, that has respect in it, that tries. And Margaret, my Margaret, she cried for 3 days straight after the board meeting, not for her brother, well, partly for her brother, but mostly, I think, for the guilt she felt about how much she had not seen, about how many times she had let her father's dismissal of me pass without challenge, about how she had occasionally, gently, not cruelly, but still sided with the family's perception of me over her knowledge of who I actually was. One evening, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, and she said, "You carried all of this for 6 years, and you never made me feel guilty about it. You never blamed me. Why, I thought about it. Because I love you. I said, not your family, not the company. You and people are complicated. Families are complicated. I knew who you were underneath all of it." She reached across the table and took my hands in hers, and that, honestly, that quiet moment in our kitchen was worth more to me than all vindication in the world. The board offered me my position back within a week of the meeting. I declined. I know that surprised people. Perhaps it surprises you, but here is the truth. I had spent 6 years working for a company that treated me as invisible, that compensated for the theft of its own most valuable asset on the backs of my 80-hour workdays, that had never once placed a plaque on a wall or a proper title on a business card to acknowledge what I had done. I had enough. Not financially, though the legal proceedings involving Dennis's contract theft resulted in a significant settlement that benefited the company substantially, and I was appropriately compensated for my role in uncovering it. No, I had enough of something else. I had enough of proving myself to people who had already decided who I was before I walked through the door. What I did instead was this. I took the knowledge I had accumulated over 35 years of financial work, and I opened a consulting practice. Just me, a small office, and a telephone. I called it Caldwell Financial Advisory. Within 8 months, I had 5 clients. Within 18 months, I had 12. One of them I should mention, and I tell you this not with bitterness, but with the particular satisfaction of a quiet man who has learned that life has a very precise sense of humor. One of them was a company that was trying to acquire a logistics business that had once been the primary competitor of Whitmore Industries. The same competitor that had, 9 years earlier, gained an unfair advantage. Through Dennis Whitmore's betrayal, I helped my client structure the acquisition. It was very successful. I went home that evening, and Margaret had made her lamb chops, the ones with the rosemary, which are extraordinary, and we sat at our kitchen table and ate dinner together, just the 2 of us, and we talked and laughed for 2 hours, and I thought, this is what I was working for all along, not the title, not the recognition. I want to say something to you before we close this story, something I mean very sincerely. This world has a habit of confusing loudness with strength, of mistaking a big title, a large office, and a confident voice for actual substance. We are trained to be impressed by people who announce their importance, who walk into rooms like they've already purchased them, who call other people lazy pigs from positions of power because they have forgotten that power is earned, not inherited. And in doing this, in worshipping the loud, and dismissing the quiet, the world makes a very dangerous error, because the quiet men and women, the ones who arrive early, stay late, do the hard work without fanfare, who hold things together with their hands while other people take the credit at the dinner table, those are often the most important people in the room. You don't know that until they leave, and by then, it is usually too late to unsay what was said. Gerald Whitmore was not a villain. He was a proud man who stopped paying attention, and his pride cost him his son's honesty, his company's competitive advantage, 6 years of his most valuable employee's invisible labor, and eventually, the thing that broke him most, I think it cost him his certainty about his own judgment. That is not a small price. Dennis Whitmore was not simply a thief. He was a man who had grown up in his father's shadow, who had never been required to actually develop himself because the shadow was large enough to stand in without growing, and who had, in a moment of weakness and fear, made a choice that slowly poisoned everything around him for 9 years. And me, I am a 61-year-old man who took a vacation in Paris, laughed at a phone call, and came home to tell the truth. I do not think of myself as brave. I was just tired of being small, and the thing about deciding you are done being small, once you make that decision, once you set it down and refuse to pick it back up, it is extraordinary how clearly you can see. Don't let anyone make you small. Not your boss, not your family, not the weight of other people's opinions of who you are. Do good work. Be honest. Take your vacation. And if someone calls you a lazy pig while you're drinking coffee beside the Seine River, laugh, hang up, order another coffee. The truth will still be there when you get home.